The quarterly strategic review was more than a meeting. It was the heartbeat of the company, a ritual where futures were decided, budgets were carved, and reputations were cemented or buried. For 6 relentless months, I had worked on the restructuring plan the board was waiting for. My research held projections, cost-saving measures, and innovations that could rescue a sinking organization. This wasn't a pitch.
It was a lifeline.
I walked into that room with confidence, knowing I carried the blueprint that could redefine our trajectory. The boardroom was a polished arena, mahogany table, projection screens glowing, and the silent anticipation of those who believed they were about to witness transformation. Every key player was present: department heads, advisors, shareholders, and investors whose signatures could turn ideas into empires. I took my place, opened my folder, and prepared to begin. That was when he stood, briefcase in one hand, inherited arrogance in the other. The CEO's son, a man whose resume consisted of nothing more than a last name, cleared his throat with theatrical importance and looked directly at me. "Your services are no longer required," he declared, as if awarding me a prize instead of executing a dismissal. He didn't blink. He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. The smirk on his face carried the message he didn't say out loud. I was no longer useful to his ambitions. His father sat motionless beside him, refusing to intervene. The silence that followed wasn't neutral, it was complicit. Eyes dropped to notepads. Pens froze midair. No one dared speak. No one dared oppose the heir apparent. Humiliation washed over me like ice water, but it didn't drown me. It crystallized something. As the room moved on without skipping a beat, something deeper awakened inside me. The realization that power wasn't loud. It didn't need announcements. Power was structural, hidden in clauses, rules, and signatures. And unlike the CEO's son, I had spent years studying the internal architecture of this company. I knew where influence truly lived. I knew how authority could be dismantled legally, quietly, and irrevocably. He thought he had crushed my career with a single sentence. What he didn't understand was simple. He hadn't ended my story. He had just granted me the perfect opening scene. Privilege has a way of disguising incompetence as destiny. The CEO's son was the embodiment of that illusion. He didn't walk into the company through the front door like the rest of us. He arrived through a side entrance paved with shortcuts, his surname acting as both resume and recommendation. While others endured interviews, probation periods, and performance reviews, he was appointed to leadership without ever earning the right to lead. The board resented it in silence, but silence in corporate halls is not neutrality, it is survival. He treated responsibility like a prop in a performance he barely understood. His days were filled with impulsive decisions dressed as innovation. He pushed deals without reading terms, approved vendors without due diligence, and signed documents he couldn't explain. Entire contracts collapsed because he mistook charisma for competence. When acquisitions failed, he blamed the market. When people quit, he accused them of lacking loyalty. His leadership didn't inspire, it infected the company with chaos. Yet, every disaster dissolved before it reached him. His father rewrote facts as easily as he rewrote budgets. Reports that should have revealed negligence conveniently vanished. Data was reframed, narratives altered, and performance reviews mysteriously amended. HR became his personal janitorial service, sweeping failures under policies they invented overnight. Titles emerged out of thin air to justify his authority: Chief Strategic Liaison, Innovation Steward, Corporate Vision Lead. They sounded impressive, but meant nothing. His influence wasn't earned, it was engineered. I didn't envy him. I observed him. People like him are predictable. They believe power is permanent because they never built anything worth losing. They don't know where their authority starts, which means they can't recognize when it slips away. I watched for cracks, not in his confidence, but in the structure enabling it. Every time his father protected him, they weakened the legal framework around his position. Every exception they made became evidence. Every rewritten report became ammunition. He lived in a world constructed to keep him relevant. But worlds built on indulgence collapse under scrutiny. My advantage wasn't wealth or lineage. It was clarity. I didn't need his surname. I didn't need his stage. I needed only one opening, one moment where arrogance outran protection. And when that moment came, his legacy didn't crumble. It evaporated because there was never anything holding it up. While he spent his days parading authority like a costume, I was dissecting the company's structure line by line. Where he saw power as a gift, I saw it as a system governed by rules, signatures, and consequences. Late at night, long after meetings ended and the parking lot emptied, I sat with binders no one touched anymore. I wasn't looking for inspiration. I was hunting for leverage. That was when I found it. Deep inside the original corporate charter, a document older than most employees, was Section 4.3, a governance clause written during the company's founding, back when leaders were chosen for competence, not inheritance. It required every board-appointed executive to undergo a biennial independent competency evaluation, not a suggestion, not an optional formality, a mandatory condition for holding authority. He never took it. He didn't even know it existed. Why would he? Men born into power rarely review the terms of their privilege. They assume permanence. They assume immunity. They assume rules are for others. His father ignored it. HR never enforced it. The board forgot it. But corporate amnesia is not legal absolution. That clause wasn't decorative ink. It was a time bomb, waiting for someone disciplined enough to light the fuse. I began collecting evidence, not rumors. Every missed KPI, every reckless contract, every acquisition he mishandled, emails confirming his approvals without documentation, budget proposals he signed without reading, compliance violations ignored because they weren't glamorous. Each piece wasn't just proof of incompetence, it was a legal argument. A narrative no board could unsee once presented. His decisions weren't merely foolish. They posed measurable financial risk. He exposed the company to penalties, audits, and breaches. He didn't lead departments, he destabilized them. And the beauty of incompetence is that it documents itself, especially when ego demands everything be done in writing. Paperwork became my shield. His arrogance became my blade. While he was busy pretending to run the company, I was assembling the case that would strip him of the right to step foot inside it. He believed authority was an inheritance. The charter proved otherwise. Power wasn't his birthright. It was conditional. And conditions, once broken, have consequences. The best victories aren't loud. They're signed, dated, and filed. The CEO spent years assuming loyalty was something he owned, not something he earned. He believed his title insulated him from scrutiny, and that his son's position was guaranteed simply because no one dared challenge them. What he never understood was that loyalty in a corporation is conditional. Board members don't protect families. They protect profit. They don't fear embarrassment. They fear losses. And once numbers start bleeding, sentiment evaporates. When I requested a board session to present my findings, the CEO arrived confident, amused even. He expected a disgruntled employee making noise. He expected emotion. What he didn't expect was documentation. I didn't bring speeches, opinions, or speculation. I brought numbers. Hard, indisputable, unforgiving numbers. Slides detailing missed targets, vendors overpaid without justification, compliance penalties waiting to explode, and acquisitions approved without due diligence. Every line pointed to the same source, the CEO's son. The room shifted immediately. Investors leaned forward. Legal counsel took notes. Shareholders whispered. No one cared about the CEO's legacy or his intentions. They cared that a single incompetent executive posed quantifiable financial damage. Suddenly, the board wasn't evaluating a personality. They were evaluating a liability. I ended the presentation with Section 4.3, projected in bold, a clause requiring competency evaluation for board-appointed executives. A clause the CEO's son had never satisfied. A clause legally enforceable. The silence was suffocating. The CEO tried to laugh it off, but numbers do not negotiate. Contracts do not blush. Policies don't bend for favorites. The board didn't see revenge in my report. They saw exposure. They saw headlines. They saw shareholders asking why an unqualified heir was steering a multi-million-dollar ship. The CEO realized then that protecting his son was no longer an act of authority. It was a financial crime waiting to be audited. The vote was swift. For the first time, the CEO wasn't the one making decisions. Section 4.3 was activated. His son would face evaluation. The CEO rose from his seat, ready to object, but the room waited. The document he had signed decades ago glared back at him. His authority crumbled under his own signature. His protest died before it reached his lips. Some defeats are accidents. Others are self-inflicted. This one was drafted, approved, and sealed by his own hand. The competency evaluation didn't resemble a performance review. It unfolded like an autopsy. The auditors weren't interested in his charm, his surname, or the stories he rehearsed in front of mirrors. They arrived with files, legal authority, and a mandate, determine whether he had ever been qualified to sit where he sat. Their questions didn't dance around politeness. They cut straight through him. They began by dissecting every initiative he allegedly led. Projects he had claimed as accomplishments turned to dust the moment someone asked for documentation. Deadlines missed, budgets inflated, and contracts approved without compliance checks formed a pattern, one not of innovation, but negligence. His responses became increasingly frantic. He tried to blame subordinates, shifting responsibility like a gambler trying to outrun debt. But auditors don't chase excuses. They chase facts. Then came the matter of qualifications. They requested certifications, leadership training, and records of evaluation, documents every legitimate executive possessed. He had none. His resume had always been stitched together by assumption, not achievement. For the first time in his privileged existence, the walls didn't bend for him. Confidence, the currency he spent so freely, held no value. Competence was the only acceptable tender, and he had none to offer. As the days progressed, his composure cracked. He arrived to sessions looking smaller, stripped of the swagger he once weaponized. Every answer he gave opened new doors for inquiry. The more he spoke, the more he revealed how profoundly unprepared he was. His decisions weren't visionary. They were reckless. His leadership wasn't strategic. It was inherited. The auditors didn't judge him. They recorded him. Their pens moved without emotion, turning his history into evidence. By the time the evaluation concluded, the report resembled a dossier rather than a review. Page after page outlined financial exposure, procedural violations, and leadership failures. It wasn't merely incompetence, it was documented liability. The board didn't debate his fate. They recognized the risk written in ink. A motion was drafted, circulated, and voted upon with chilling efficiency. He entered the evaluation believing he was untouchable, a prince destined to inherit a corporate kingdom. But the kingdom had rules he never learned, and thrones are only secure when they are earned. He walked in with a title. He left with nothing but his name, and even that no longer opened doors. Removing him from power addressed the present, but it did nothing to protect the future. Companies don't collapse from one fool. They collapse when systems allow fools to repeat themselves. I understood that if legacy could override competence once, it could happen again. So while the board was still stunned from the audit, I presented one final document, a proposed amendment to the company charter. The language was simple, but the implications were seismic. No executive role could be assigned, inherited, or transferred to any individual who had not passed an independent competency certification. No exceptions. No shortcuts. No bloodline immunity. The proposal stripped entitlement of its camouflage and forced accountability into the company's DNA. Nepotism wasn't merely discouraged, it was outlawed. The board members read the text carefully, and for the first time, I watched them process the magnitude of their oversight. They hadn't just tolerated incompetence, they had institutionalized it. The CEO paled as the room shifted. This wasn't about his son anymore. It was about every assumption he had built his legacy upon. The silent gears of corporate governance started turning. Shareholders whispered. Advisors nodded. Legal counsel confirmed its enforceability. The board didn't hesitate. When the vote was called, hands rose without pause, not out of spite, but out of necessity. Profit protects itself, and no investor will gamble on a dynasty built on ignorance. The amendment passed unanimously. It didn't simply remove the CEO's son from the executive tier. It barricaded the door he once believed was his birthright. That single vote severed the invisible umbilical cord between the family name and corporate authority. The surname that once acted like a master key became dead weight. No future heir would slide into power without proving their worth. The era of inherited leadership was over, not just for him, but for every relative who ever imagined their lineage was a resume. He wasn't facing a demotion. He was facing extinction. His influence wasn't just diminished, it was rewritten out of structural possibility. He couldn't return, challenge, or claw his way back. The rules no longer recognized him. In one stroke of ink, his legacy transformed from an open road into a sealed vault. He wasn't merely removed. He was rendered irrelevant by design. Corporate power doesn't change with announcements. It shifts with perception. The moment the charter amendment passed, the atmosphere inside and outside the company transformed. Investors who had been preparing exit strategies suddenly paused. The panic that once clouded every conversation evaporated. Reports circulated that governance had finally matured, that leadership was being rebuilt on merit rather than inheritance, and that accountability had found its spine. The market responded faster than any memo could explain. Stock prices stabilized, then began a slow climb. Partners who had distanced themselves returned with renewed interest, relieved to see structure replacing chaos. Rumors changed direction like a tide. What once sounded like the downfall of a corporation began to resemble the correction of a dynasty gone rogue. Analysts praised the board for finally acting. Shareholders applauded the removal of a financial risk disguised as an executive. Industry newsletters wrote headlines that framed the transformation as bold, necessary, and overdue. The message was clear: the company wasn't dying. It was evolving. The CEO, who had spent years shielding his son from consequences, saw his influence crumble in real time. He resigned not with rage, but with exhaustion. His departure wasn't theatrical. It was quiet, unceremonious, and almost invisible, an acknowledgement that his authority had become weight without purpose. When a leader loses the power to protect his own mythology, stepping down becomes the only dignified option. His son, however, refused to go quietly. He tried to rewrite the narrative of his fall. He spoke of betrayal, sabotage, hidden agendas. He framed himself as a visionary misunderstood by lesser minds. But stardom requires substance, and he had never built anything with his own hands. His version of events had no audience. Influence borrowed is influence that disappears the moment the lender stops caring. He hadn't been dethroned. He had been revealed. As for me, I never requested elevation. There were no speeches, no campaign for recognition, no hunger for applause. But power isn't always granted through titles. Sometimes it settles into the hands of the person who understands the architecture of a system better than those who tried to misuse it. My authority wasn't ceremonial. It was structural, woven into policies, clauses, and frameworks, the same machinery he once assumed would guarantee his reign. I didn't replace him. I replaced the conditions that made him possible. Revenge is emotional. It burns hot, fades quickly, and often destroys the one who seeks it. Justice, on the other hand, does not need noise to be felt. Justice endures. It etches itself into systems, into processes, into history, and into the very bones of organizations. The company I once served learned that difference the hard way. They believed power came from hierarchy, proximity, and names printed on office doors. They never understood that true power comes from authorship, who writes the rules, who knows the structure, and who can alter the foundation without lifting their voice. The downfall began long before anyone realized it. For years, the leadership believed they were untouchable. They hired and fired on whims, celebrated loyalty while poisoning merit, and replaced competence with lineage. They imagined their decisions were protected by authority alone. But authority without accountability is a sandcastle waiting for the tide. With every ignored regulation, every altered report, and every blind promotion, they loosened the bolts that held their empire together. Their arrogance wasn't loud, it was systemic. It infected everything. Their greatest mistake, however, wasn't incompetence. It was assuming everyone else was blind to it. When they dismissed me publicly, they expected applause. They expected compliance. They expected my silence to follow me out the door like a shadow. They believed reputations only mattered when spoken aloud, not when written into law. As I walked away from that boardroom, I didn't feel broken. I felt sharpened. They thought humiliation would weaken my resolve. They never imagined humiliation would give me clarity. The CEO's son believed power was inherited, not earned. He assumed authority was a chair he would eventually occupy because nobody dared move it. He overlooked the truth written beneath every corporation that ever survived more than one generation. Power is not a throne. It is a responsibility. When he sat atop systems he did not understand, he performed leadership like a child playing dress-up. He enjoyed the spotlight, but he never learned the weight of what held it up. His father fed this illusion. Instead of teaching him discipline, he taught him entitlement. Instead of demanding growth, he offered excuses. Instead of earning respect, he demanded it. They built a kingdom of glass and called it legacy. No one questioned them, not because they inspired loyalty, but because everyone feared instability. Fear, however, is not respect. And systems built on fear collapse the moment someone stops participating in a lie. The Charter Amendment exposed that truth with surgical precision. When Section 4.3 resurfaced, it didn't scream. It didn't threaten. It didn't accuse. It simply existed. Words drafted decades earlier, words forgotten, ignored, and underestimated, became the hinge that turned the entire corporate machine against its false prince. Law does not need witnesses. It needs signatures. His downfall was not an act of rebellion. It was the result of his inheritance outrunning his ability. It was the legal equivalent of gravity. No matter how high arrogance tried to climb, it had no protection from the fall. The board didn't remove him because they finally saw me. They removed him because they finally saw themselves. His incompetence wasn't a personal flaw, it was a financial liability. His ignorance wasn't merely annoying, it was dangerous. Investors don't care about tantrums, ego, or family trees. They care about returns. When faced with proof, not emotion, not opinion, but documented violations, they did what institutions always do when survival is at stake. They chose order over sentiment. Once the board acted, everything changed. The room that once applauded his empty declarations now scrutinized everything he touched. Every decision he made was re-examined under the harsh light of legal obligation. His speeches, once admired, became evidence. His confidence, once encouraged, became incriminating. In the end, he didn't lose power. He was proven never to have possessed it. The Charter Amendment wasn't revenge. Revenge reacts. Justice rewrites. Revenge depends on memory. Justice doesn't need to remember. It ensures others cannot forget. The new rule didn't simply remove him. It removed the very idea that someone like him could ever rise again without proving themselves. It locked the door behind his exit and welded it shut. Anyone who tried to walk the same path would face the same requirement: competence, verifiable and undeniable. That was the true victory. It wasn't in seeing him escorted out. It wasn't in the silence that followed his resignation. It wasn't even in the emails congratulating me on my contribution, as though I had simply fixed a minor policy oversight. The victory was structural. It was written into the system. It was permanent. The company now had integrity coded into its governance. Nepotism wasn't just frowned upon, it was prohibited. Power was no longer a birthright. It was a process. This wasn't about ego. It was about architecture. Structures outlive people. Titles fade. Offices change. Leadership rotates. But charters endure. They remain untouched by rumor, personality, and emotion. Once something is engraved into a charter, it stops being a preference. It becomes law. He tried to build a legacy on inheritance. I built one on statute. One dissolves with memory. The other survives challenge, leadership changes, and even time itself. The irony is almost poetic. The same paper they used to legitimize his authority ultimately removed it. The same signatures they boasted about became the signatures that nullified his future. He believed rules protected him. He never thought rules could protect others from him. He saw processes as inconveniences. He never realized processes are what separate corporations from chaos. History won't remember him because there was nothing to remember. He left no achievements, no innovations, no decisions that benefited anyone. His presence didn't shape the company, it drained it. But history will remember what replaced him. The moment entitlement was outlawed and accountability became culture. Laws don't celebrate people. They correct them. They reflect the mistakes that forced their creation. He thought he was the protagonist of the company's narrative. He didn't understand he was merely the catalyst. Some leaders inspire greatness. Others inspire change by embodying everything that must never be repeated. His was the second kind. It may not be glamorous, but it is influential in its own way. As for me, I didn't seek statues, speeches, or applause. I didn't shout, demand attention, or parade my role in the transformation. I did something far quieter and infinitely more powerful. I rewrote the rules. I shifted the axis of authority. I took the weapon of arrogance and reforged it into policy. I replaced inheritance with competence and turned entitlement into extinction. Revenge would have ended with his downfall. Justice began with it. They fired employees to protect him. They silenced critics to shield him. They reshaped the culture so his reflection wouldn't crack the glass. But culture bends. Charters do not. Charters do not gossip.
They do not lie.
They do not forget. I didn't raise my voice. I raised the charter. And long after the last person who remembers this story retires, long after the board changes, long after offices move, long after names fade, the lesson will remain printed in law. No power without proof, no leadership without competence, no shortcuts through bloodlines. They will not remember the boy who confused inheritance with destiny. They will remember the person who quietly ensured he would never rise again, not through anger, not through spectacle, but through structure. Because there are victories you celebrate for a night, and there are victories carved into eternity.